Alrighty. I think people are beginning to meander in. Hopefully, if I keep talking like this over the mic, that will continue to bring even more people in. It's good coffee out there. Alrighty, folks, so welcome to panel 2, the EU's role in the Black Sea region. As Maya introduced me, I'm Aaron. I'm a Templeton Fellow here at FPRI. I do a lot of podcast content, one of which is about Europe, EU, what's changing because of events in Ukraine. It's called The Continent. But I'm really excited to be moderating this panel for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's fantastic to be back in Georgia. I really love it here. If I may issue a complaint, I find that when I tweet insights about Russia, that'll get 2 or 3 likes, but when I tweet a picture of Khachapuri I'm eating, that'll get 100 likes, and I feel like it's unfair. But no, I think we're having this panel at a profoundly interesting time, geopolitically, politically, economically, where EU had, and I'm sure we'll hear about this, been a fairly idealistic organization and has been forced to contend with hard politics and security, and I think that has fascinating implications going forward. I think the other reason I'm excited for this too is my specialization is in Russia and security. I'm not an EU specialist, so I'm excited to learn a lot over the course of this panel and ask questions that will help me learn, hopefully help you learn too. With that said, we're gonna kick this off with, well, let me start by introducing the panelists, and then we'll hear their remarks. So up first will be Serghei Ostaf, who is a Security and Democratization Expert and Policy Analyst with CReDO, Moldova. Up next is Tkeshelashvili, President of the Georgian Institute for Strategic Studies. Following will be Irakli Porchkhidze, co-founder and vice president of the Georgian Institute for Strategic Studies. Last but not least, Antonia, senior analyst and chief operations officer at Geopolitical Futures. With all that said, we'll let Serghei have the floor.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this panel. As Aaron was saying, yesterday's evening discussions and Khachapuri, Dina and the like have changed my mind. So today in the morning I woke up with a different idea what I'm going to say today. And therefore I think I will abort very straightforward in an upfront way the question that was put up in the panel title, which is basically the EU role in the Black Sea region. And I should speak about like 4 or 5 potential roles that EU, European Union, can play in Black Sea region. And of course, I hope that I capture some of the expectations of the people and those who are thinking and dwelling on the fate of the region, and specifically from Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. I'm not going to review comprehensively or whatever in a technical manner what the current strategy of EU in Black Sea region is. I think you can find many different sources on that, and interesting and very informative. I would be basically confronting the question and trying to come up with the 4 or 5, in my understanding, key roles that the EU should be playing in the changing and basically already changed and emergingly substantially changing region. It could also be a bit provocative for the EU to go through the key ideas that I will be saying in terms of the rethinking the role that EU has played so far and what EU should be playing, what kind of roles it should be playing in the future. I am not attempting to create the vision for these roles, because it depends very much on the outcome of the current war of aggression, and I think we all aspire and think that Ukraine will defeat Russian aggression, Russian war of aggression. But anyway, there are many specificities that we cannot predict at this point of time. Therefore, it's not about an attempt to create division for the playing of the role of the EU in this region. So I will start first with the role that the EU could play in Black Sea region as a hard security enabler. What I would define this role as using multiple instruments that it has already started to use in respect to support Ukraine in defending Russia in the war of aggression, is by providing various financial support, direct financial support and indirect financial support to enable Ukrainian military and Ukrainian society to resist and defend. It is also about supporting developing technology, both military and otherwise. And again, when I'm speaking about the enabler, it doesn't mean that it is going to be the provider, or it doesn't mean that it's an exclusive enabler. It's a complementary role. And EU is starting to experiment with this role, I think with tangible success, and I think it should bolden its effort to become a much prominent and responsible enabler for the region. There are also elements of the co-participation, slowly emphasizing the role of the enabler into the co-provider of the security, definitely in partnership, initially substantially as a junior or as a secondary partner to NATO, to US, to NATO countries, but also helping to nurture, to create some of the regional regional countries coalitions that could bolden the conventional and non-conventional capability in the region to defend from potential future threats coming from the country of aggression in the Black Sea, which is basically Russia. Another aspect related to the potential role of the hard security enabler is definitely the improved role of in contributing decisively in solving some of the region frozen conflicts or the conflicts which we inherited since 90s. And let's say one example is Moldova with the Transnistrian conflict. And there is a very modest role and insignificant role that EU has played so far in supporting the region, and Moldova particularly, in getting rid of the conflict. It brings my thoughts, my ideas that the EU should assume a much substantial role, together, of course, as I said earlier, in partnership with other actors in contributing decisively in solving some of the problems and related to frozen conflicts. And it should not be a norm to tolerate for years regional conflicts that were inspired and created and basically being maintained by the Russia as an aggressor. So these are like the first role that I thought that it reflects a lot of the ideas and a lot of the expectations from many in our region. And so far, of course, it provides a challenge for the EU to assume this substantial changing or in transformative role that it should play. But otherwise, who else? And okay, why not? If the European Union and countries of European Union would like to create a space which is free and capable of being called as part of the Euro-Atlantic partnership. The second role that has been mostly discussed and the European Union has assumed some of its responsibilities regarding this role is about the so-called soft security area, which I put it in the words like supporting, basically becoming a soft security builder and co-provider. In the first role, I tried to put it in the way like enabler, supporting others, providing necessary means, financial, technology, and others. Here, I'm trying to define it in the way like soft security builder and provider, a co-provider. That also includes, of course, elements of the resilience of the societies. And to detail this role, potential role, I would like to speak, to bring the elements of the supporting the communities in the countries of the Baltic countries to become more resilient, strengthened, and addressing a number of different fault lines and vulnerabilities. We cannot find, if we read carefully through different strategies that EU has developed as policy documents, or sometimes it followed also with some of the actions and particular mechanisms and instruments, because there is a clear discrepancy between the positions and declarations and what happens on the ground. So there is a discrepancy. So if we look through all of these documents that the EU has produced, we find some elements of the issues regarding the resilience and soft security addressed. There are some entities created. We know that there is one in the Baltic countries, there is one in Romania, that are somehow trying to address the issue of the resilience and cybersecurity or security related to the addressing some of the vulnerabilities. But these are very shy steps into the area. And the EU has, specifically in this role, has to deliver much more and become and assume a much more substantial role. And definitely it should be done in partnership with the countries and with some other organizations like NATO specifically, but also together with the aspiring NATO countries, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, and of course United States. So these elements are related to the building and strengthening the immunity of the countries to be susceptible to external threats, to vulnerabilize the society. Other elements that they should be spelled out in the strategies of the EU in fulfilling this role is definitely about various types of informational campaigns targeting different regions and individuals. There is also assessment of vulnerability should not be done on a general but a very much specific level, and addressing these vulnerabilities with the specific measures in supporting particular actors, specialized actors, and entities. This is, in my understanding, that could be another assumed role of the EU in the Black Sea region. And it is most likely that here the EU should play one of the prominent roles in assuming most of the needs to be addressed rather than other regions. Whereas in the first role, I was trying to make a point that there are some other important actors who could play a prime role. But in the second role, in my understanding, the EU should play a much more substantial and prominent role. The third role, I defined it like EU should play an active integrator role rather than the role that we currently observe, where it plays the role of the creating the incentives, then judging about the performance, providing here and there some of the support for the compliance, and then judging about the progress. I think the EU should understand that as an institution, as an entity, that the Black Sea region belongs to Europe, to wider, and actually the healthiness of the region, it impacts adversely if things go wrong entire Europe, and therefore the integration role should be taken much more seriously with more specific and concrete measures to support the transition of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia into the process of the integration. It should not be seen as a situation when the countries are being supported to perform, and then we'll be judging about the progress and giving the decisions of yes or no and the like. There should be a joint process, a mutual commitment to the process of speeding up the integration process. And of course, we can speak about specific mechanisms related to all the financial or other instruments that the EU has inside, but we simply don't have time for that. And there is quite an instrumentarium developed already. We can speak about a bit later, or how it could be arranged more efficiently to fulfill this role of the EU integrator. So EU as a EU integrator, not just an observer or supporter or eventually evaluator or judge about the process and the speed of the process. Another important role, this comes very much from the expectations from people on the ground, meaning from our countries, and I heard that many times. Like the last but not least role that comes to complete the picture, the final picture of the 4 key roles that you should play in the Black Sea region is, I put it the way, like UN values and international law key advocator in the region. I mean, we all have seen how the international law in relationships between countries were brutally violated, how individuals, entities have suffered numerously the violations of work related to the war crimes, humanitarian crimes, but also genocide and the like, how the UN Charter obligations both have been aggressively violated, but sometimes also by some of the countries have not been assumed and have not been implemented. I can give you a couple of examples, like for example, just give me one specific example, to what extent Moldova, for example, lives up with the UN Charter obligations related to the fact that some of this territory is being used in order to replicate or sustain elements of the aggression against Ukraine. So there are many other elements related to that, but it looks, in my perspective, the EU should play the key and an active and assertive role in the Black Sea region in order to, in advocating the respect, but also taking specific concrete actions in order to make sure that the UN rules and international law is being implemented and respected by all the actors, and specifically because we have 2 major actors in the region, with the attempts to avoid or to speculate or use mostly the interest perspective rather than the rule of law and rule-based systems. Of course, it's a Russian aggressor, but there are some other actors as well. So these are the 4. I would just recapitulate them: the hard security enabler, moving closer to the co-provider, then also resilience and soft security builder and co-provider, then EU integrator, an active actor as an integrator, but also UN values, international law, and key advocator and proponent. These are the 4, and of course, in order to do a proper academic exercise, we have to look at the current capabilities of the EU in order to fulfill these roles. And of course, we have to think in terms of what would be the outcome and the vision for each of these roles. And also, but it looks like it's a bit of the putting a pressure on the EU. But otherwise, if we don't have these 4 roles fulfilled and assumed by EU, the region, the Black Sea region, is going to look much worse. And these are the particular needs that should be fulfilled by someone. And there are fewer actors who could fulfill or complement in fulfilling these roles. The individual countries are too weak in order to do that. And EU has sufficient international authority, together with other partners, to assume this responsibility. These are the key ideas, and I would be happy to develop them later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Up next is Tkeshelashvili.
Hi, glad to be here. It's been a while that I haven't had a chance in my own country, in my own city, so to be at the event and speaking to the audience. So particularly glad to be here today. Now, I'll build on some of it that you already mentioned so that I wouldn't repeat sort of the vision of the role of the EU in different directions that you mentioned, but I'd like to start with infusing a little bit of the picture of what it feels when we speak about the EU and what we mean when we speak about the EU being citizens of countries in this region. And it's never been for us in terms of bureaucracy, processes, all of it that you learn about when you start to be part of the process, when you negotiate and then when you start to advance the cause of your own country in this direction. But then it starts from the vision of belonging, and at least that has been quite firmly for my own generation that went still through the dissolution of the Soviet Union, had very naive maybe understanding of the world sort of works, and then what were the chances for us to be sooner or later part of EU and NATO. But what organizations have always been part of that vision, deeply ingrained vision in our society of where we belonged. And then unlike to some or most in the Western societies that still had the vision that shared neighborhood in this part of the world between Russia and the West could have been a possibility, I guess we've never had that vision or even hope for that. Having a historical experience of living in the vicinity of Russia and being annexed by Russia early on in the history, being liberated, again being occupied by Soviets, and then liberated in late 20th century at that time. So our understanding was very sober always, that either we belong to the family of democracies, and in our part of the world that was the EU, and that was the pathway for democratic development, for prosperity economically, social cohesion, and then NATO was always regarded as part of the security. And then it was never been a question of either or, so to say, and I guess that was always the part of the vision for everybody in this part of the world as well. So it's not that, okay, we can get to the EU and NATO could not be that much important, or NATO completely fulfills the hope what EU could bring to the society. But a little bit of response maybe to some of the comments that were made during the previous panel. If it ever becomes a choice, looking now what happens in Ukraine, having gone through the experience of the war, aggression, and then continued occupation in Georgia itself, I would personally trade in a heartbeat EU for NATO, because it's quite clear that you can have all the benefits of economic prosperity, visa liberalization as Ukrainians already had, quite good potential for economic growth, change, transformation. It can go like that if Russia gets after you. So security matters more because that's the foundation, and then you can build on that within or without the EU. So in that case, believe me, none of the Georgian citizens will feel that it doesn't matter when it comes to NATO membership compared to being free to travel in Europe. We can get along with travel without visa liberalization as well if it comes to that. Now, when it comes to the EU and the role in the Black Sea region, EU is a greatest success story after the Second World War. And again, NATO made that possible too when it comes to the security guarantees that EU itself and EU member countries had in terms of the parallel tracks of the development. But EU is about many unfinished businesses as well as a story. And it's not only here in the Black Sea region, and Turkey is the greatest example of that as well, greatest strategic miscalculation that you could have done historically as well previously. It's, if we speak about Europe as well, there are former sort of Balkan countries, if we look into that and what happens in Serbia right now, and then potential of a challenge there as well, with Bosnia-Herzegovina and other countries in that region. The story was complex and remains to be complex, and there is quite a lot of unfinished business there as well, where EU acted more of a bureaucracy rather than a strategic actor. And I guess part of what we are seeing right now is an awakening moment for the EU when EU understands that it has to regain strategic role. And it's not just about how you do sectoral reforms, how you bring economic prosperity, but you have a responsibility towards your member countries and then towards the citizens of the EU to make it sustainable and to be resilient in the world that is changing. And I guess part of that significantly is because of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, But part of that is due to the consistent signaling from the US as well, that security umbrella from the US or the role of the US could not be taken for granted, because US is shifting its attention, right, to the Pacific. Now it's because of the war that it's sort of a comeback that we're experiencing partially, but it's hopefully going to go away after Ukrainian victory to some degree, right? But will stay still when it comes to maintaining NATO and then strength in the region and then Ukraine's military build-up. But having said that, we're not there yet. So we see that trend. We see that in quick reaction of the EU, and it's unprecedented when it comes to how quick EU came up with that potential of candidacy for the membership for the countries that previously were part of associated relationship with the EU, which in itself was a step forward some time ago, even though not sufficient even at that time, back in 2008 as an aftermath of the war. But now we have that reality when EU member countries do understand that European security cannot be imagined without at least Ukraine being part of the EU. And I just came from pretty much a Ukraine week in London with a big Ukraine reconstruction recovery conference, and then all of the political declarations that have been made there as well, apart from the promises on economic recovery and reconstruction. And it's been shocking. I mean, you sit there in the audience and you have an Italian foreign minister saying that exactly those words, that European security is unimaginable without EU's membership, without Ukraine's membership in the EU. That would have been shocking even a year ago if you would think of it. So that change is, and discourse is changing. It's not yet mainstreamed in the bureaucracy and institutionalization of processes of the EU. However, that has started already as well when it comes to creation of the internal bodies, departments, and then special enlargement mechanisms specifically targeted on Ukraine. Having said that, I think one of the biggest roles for the EU in this region would be to emerge as a strategic actor so that it ceases to be just the Brussels bureaucracy that has its own bubble, has its own processes that can make you or kill you, depending what is the political intention behind it. And then if EU emerges as a strategic actor, that means that EU needs to have a bold strategy in owning and acting upon the premise that Black Sea is its own region. It's not a neighborhood, it's not a periphery. And then we've seen from all the consequences of the war that what happens in this region can unravel the whole European Union. And it's the biggest challenge EU and Europe in general that it faces after the Second World War, no doubt about that. So what will happen now in Ukraine and how EU will be able to act swiftly with strategic vision behind it in terms of integration of Ukraine, Moldova, and would very much hope so, my own country, Georgia as well, will be the test of what will be the future of Europe, if you think of it. Europe is not a global actor as much as US is. It's a very strong economic actor, but it's not strategic global actor. EU has a chance of becoming part of the community of the global actors from the transatlantic side of that. And I'm not preaching here for multipolar world, but we don't know what this world will be. We are in the moment when it is being shaped. And if we are not shaping that, we're going to face maybe different case scenarios in this direction. Now, having said that, the biggest test of how you, apart from the integration processes, could manage to keep up with that challenge and opportunity at the same time will be what will be the level, efficiency, and transparency with that of recovery of Ukraine. Because if you think of it, what happens in the war, it's one sort of indicator in this regard, and that's the victory of Ukraine. That should be the only goal that we all need to have now in this case scenario if we want to have anything resembling security or prosperity in this region and beyond. But beyond that, when it comes to recovery of Ukraine, that will be the biggest test of whether or not EU can be an actor that can deliver. EU on its own will not be able to do that. Sometimes I hear in Washington as well voices when I travel there that, we are picking up the security bill and then mostly, so to say, you should do the recovery and reconstruction. It's not going to be right, and I don't think that will be the policy of the US, judging from how much US is already helping, not only in humanitarian action, but in all all the assistance, including direct financial aid that goes to Ukraine right now. But having said that, there will be collective action in which EU might need to lead with the strategic vision behind it, because at the end of the day, recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine will be part of the integration of Ukraine into the EU as well. So everything that we talk about when it comes to the green transition, when we talk about building better, when we talk about what will be the institutional build-up of Ukraine and economic recovery that will emerge after the victory, and something as a fast recovery is already being done in Ukraine, that will send the signal that Europe can make it, and Europe can and should be reckoned with, and that will be the best signal that China might get as well, if you ask me, when it comes to the future challenge Taiwan that be or beyond as well in that region, that messing up with neighbors or countries that want to maintain their independence and security is not that much of a good idea. Ultimately, it doesn't pay off, and it's more costly rather than benefiting to any strategic goals that you might have. And finally, when it comes to what happens after the war in Ukraine, we frequently talk about that. We frequently link our hopes with that as well, especially in Georgia, having a very difficult situation as Georgia has right now, when it comes to not only the security front, but significant erosion of democratic credentials of the country, and then linking more to the Russian orbit rather than to the West when it comes to the latest dynamics in this direction. We still do have a chance, but not a guarantee, that we'll be part of transatlantic community rather than a part of the community that Russia might be still able to scramble, depending on the ending of this war. The way I look at that, there will be very little opportunity for having gray zones in this part of the world. So it will be a division that will be reminiscent to what we've had during the Cold War, because deterrence and containment of Russia seems to me is the only plausible policy one can have to contain a spillover effect from Russia during the time that Russia will face quite a bit of chaos and internal instability. And we've seen only the prequel of that with the Prigozhin's adventure during this weekend, which means that we need to build our own resiliences, we need to build our own alliances so that we are ultimately ending up on the right side of the history, on the right side of that division. Because that division might not be a short term, depending how quick again Russia disintegrates. EU could and should play a key role in it, in this process. And I would say that more bold, open, non-diplomatic engagement in the countries where, like Georgia, where society at large is pro-Western, not only pro-Western, but profoundly committed to the values and principles that are underpinning the Union itself, it's worth to fight for us. So it's worth fight for us, and then not to abandon us, so to say. And I do understand the logic, well, perhaps the candidacy status was not given at the time to Georgia. We've had, I don't remember exactly, but a week and a half before that, one of the most prominent media person, Nika Guarami, at the time arrested. He's now released based on the president's pardon. But it seemed as if the Georgian government did everything to sabotage the process at the time. But it's not the lost cause. We can still make it. Not maybe in a very short period of time when the decisions now need to be made in 2023, but we need to mobilize forces on our end so that we stay on course where we belong. And then I think EU needs to do more as well, for being more vigilant in terms of identifying and highlighting malfunctioning of the system as it is now in Georgia, and providing more opportunities and incentives to improve, having clarity on the prospect on what it will be for Georgia as well if we change the course, and then ultimately we'll be on par with Moldova and Ukraine when it comes to the integration process within the EU. So I'll end at that. I guess I already talked too much.
Thank you very much for your insights. We'll turn it to Irakli now.
Thank you very much. Just a point to make. I'm also affiliated with Ilia State University as an associate professor. So since we are at the university premises, I wanted to make that point. I think a lot of turf has been covered so far about the importance of the EU in the region and what can be done, and what are some of the ideas. I'll I'll also kind of touch upon that, but I was given kind of a 4 points to talk about, which is the enlargement prospects, the resilience part of the strengthening resilience, development assistance, and of course a big pillar, which is the economic cooperation. And these are very tangible points, so I would like to kind of touch upon them. But before that, I guess I'll make a few points. I think many people have talked, during this panel and before that as well, about the importance of what is happening in Ukraine. And I think that's also very much having a huge importance for the enlargement prospects as well. I think many people understand here that we were part of the Eastern Partnership with 5 other countries, and it turned out that since we were considered to be, there was an association trio with Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, and the war gave us all an opportunity to become accession trio. And that's a very different perspective, because the biggest problem with the Eastern Partnership was that there was no graduation formula. So we have been given a graduation formula, certain type of that, with the ills that happened in Ukraine. So we have to understand that that window of opportunity is there. And we also have to understand here as well, but also in many other parts, that that window might not be open for a very long time. And that's particularly to be heeded by the elites here as well in Georgia, and I'll try to give you a sense of why I'm saying that, but also because of the internal dynamics inside EU, which are going to define the prospects and enlargement as such. And I think that in the next year is going to be extremely important when it comes to that. Well, just to kind of throw some ideas, I think many have talked about this, but I think that EU is not punching to the way that it has. In the region, but everyone understands also elsewhere. But so their clout is much greater than it's often perceived by the Brussels itself. Unfortunately, it's not sometimes kind of supported by the tangibles on the ground. They do have an ideational power, and that's extremely important, I think. When people talk about the tangibles, people often omit that soft power element or the normative power that EU still has, and it has it greatly here as well. So we have to understand that putting more emphasis on that is going to be of extreme importance. Well, there's going to be a decision made in October, which is going to be about the prospects of the enlargement. As you know, Moldova and Ukraine, they already have the status, the candidate status. Georgia is still in a limbo, let's say. Eka rightly mentioned that what we can talk about the Georgia's stance right now is that we are a case study for a self-sabotage or self-shooting in the foot. But I think it has a rationale from the side of the Georgian government, and we can talk about that as well, why it's being done, what is more important for them. So the question is going to be in October to be decided. So the Moldova and Ukraine are given the kind of the formal start of the negotiations. So the enlargement will start. And for Georgia, what is happening with Georgia? Well, the idea in Brussels is to maintain the trio. Okay, so many people think that Georgia is not going to be given the candidate status, which makes sense from what the Georgian government has been doing with what I have mentioned, but in the end, there are very powerful arguments also for giving Georgia the status, and of course it's linked with the prospects. And many people think that dividing trio is not going to be a good idea in many respects. Also, Georgia will get a candidate status, which means that it's recognized formally that one day it can become a member, so it's a member-linked process, not an associated country anymore, but it still means that before that you have the official or the formal start of negotiations, which also has to be a process driven by the interest of EU. So Georgia can be given this status in October, provided that it's not, but it's kind of kept in the hole, in a corridor until the elections next year. Okay, so there is this idea in Brussels, which have been entertained, that Georgia will be given the candidate status in spite of all the things that are happening here with these occurrences and events. But of course, it will keep the Georgian elites alert, so they behave in a certain way. So they're going to be carrots, and then it will depend actually on the what will be happening during the elections and the run up to that. Well, most likely Moldova and Ukraine will get will officially or formally start the negotiations, and more or less the countries are going forward on that path. While Ukraine, with all the costs that are bearing, of course, are going to be there. With Moldova being smart in their policy, let's be very frank, because I mean, to evaluate all the trio, Georgia is still doing better when it comes to institutional part, which is the kind of a part of the Copenhagen criteria for the membership and of course for the process itself. But when it comes to political element, it's still lacking. I mean, the Georgian part. But when it comes to other sides, I mean, if you compare the countries, I mean, Georgia is not doing that badly. So considering that, I think we will have a dynamic. Another thing which we have to look at, and I think that window might be closing, is also related to the internal election cycle inside the EU. So many people understand that next year is going to be the big year for the institutions, because there's going to be an elections of the European Parliament, also of the head of the Commission, and the Commission itself has to be selected, also the President of the Council. So people understand that that window which is open might close at certain points. So if there are proponents to that enlargement, people actually are considering that let's have that thing on the cards for now. So we have to look at that as well. Well, when it comes to economic cooperation, I mean, we know that we have a DCFTA with the EU. Things started up pretty well the first 2 years. I mean, we have approximately 25% of imports coming from EU as a single unit. I mean, not the separate countries, of course. But there is an alarming development, which is that it's not really increasing, and it has been stalled, especially on the side of Georgian exports to EU, and it's actually dwindling. It went all the way from 22 to 15 this year, and the dynamic is even worse in the first quarter. So it's going to be approximately 14.7. So what we are seeing is that this the perk, which was given a tangible thing, unfortunately is not keeping up with the trajectory. But what is even more alarming is what I call a increasing structural dependency on Russian market. And when it comes to the influence of Russia and the increase of that, not only because of the way our government is behaving, but also the structural elements of that dependence is increasing. And I'll try to give you a sense of that. Russia is becoming extremely important when it comes to the imports to Georgia. It's actually second country when it comes to imports. And when it comes to exports, it's the third country in the pack. But when you look at the structure of those imports, it's even more alarming because of the so-called food security part. We get 95% of wheat from Russia. Okay, that's a serious increase from 2 years, actually, if you consider 2020. If you look at the oils and petroleum products, dependence is also increasing, and there is a reason behind it. We can talk about it. If you look other parts of the pack, when for example, if you look at the exports, what is alarming is that some of the typical Georgian export items are being tied to Russia these days, which is wine, which also has an emotional dimension into whole Georgian political, but also economic, let's say, realm. So that dependence is increasing, but it's not only about the trade, and it's also about, for example, remittances. Russia Russia basically increased its remittances to Georgia year to year 400%. And then it shows the trend because of the emigration from Russia, or I don't want to call it an emigration, but an influx of Russians which is happening en masse here in Georgia, and they actually do settle as a community these days. And of course, it creates the financial movement of certain type, and of course, remittances are one of the part of that. But actually, it's not only remittances, because if you look at the sheer size of this money which is coming, which is almost 2 billion, it's actually more than the FDI that Georgia gets. So to understand, we get more money from Russia from remittances than from FDI per annum. But also we have to understand that this is not a remittance from person to person, because there are certain schemes, I'm pretty sure, where the Russian money has been moved in order to create a, meet the certain demands that Russian market will have. So we understand what that means, from many perspectives. For example, the cars, the re-export of cars has been a big part of Georgian economy, and now Russia has become a #1 destination. It has never been the case, but this year it's the case. So we are structurally becoming dependent on Russia, and we all understand that it is a vulnerability. Also, tourists. Almost 20% of tourists or the visitors come from Russia these days. Georgia is a tourist-reliant country, and it's also a fast money, just to give it to the audience, the understanding that it's a fast money in a way that economy absorbs the tourist money in a very fast way. So it has a huge impact on the households. And if that is removed, for example, if Russia bans from Russians kind of coming to Georgia, that will have a huge effect on our economy. So I think these are the trends that we have to be looking at. It is there. Well, other problem, of course, the resilience. I mean, when we talk about what I have explained right now is exactly what the state shouldn't be doing when it wants to be resilient, of course, not to be dependent on its foe, not to be dependent on the occupying force. Let's be very clear. So what we have nowadays in Georgia is that the government is not only doing that, but it's also fanning friction and division inside the country. So it creates this division about kind of pro-Russian and not pro-Russian part of the Georgian society, so-called the war party and non-war party, or so-called the peasers. So this whole barrage of propaganda, which is spewed by the government, creates the vulnerabilities, which is not what the resilient entity should be doing. Well, of course, we have to commend Ukraine for what it has done, and that's what it should be doing for the reasons of what in the face of the threat that it has. But Georgia, when looking at that, is doing everything in order to kind of not to do things on the kind of in accordance with the playbook, and this is scary. This is scary because if there is any type of detour from what is happening right now, Georgia is going to be in the very vulnerable situation. It is already, by the way. Well, then we also have the kind of the soft power element of the EU, what it has been doing here, and there are certain parts to it. Of course, the development assistance is important, but it's much wider than that, of course. And there are a few pillars to it, which is mobility. It's not only visa-free. Many people think it's only visa-free. It's not only visa-free. It's much more than that. It's also about the education and the linkages which are created with the scientific, but also in general with academic sphere, but also the culture. So EU is invested quite a lot in that. Actually, they have invested more than $1 billion throughout 15 years. There is, last, I'd say 7-8 years, and there is a pledge to do half of that, in the upcoming 3 years. So, but there are also a very important component to what EU is doing, which is the connectivity part, which is also very tangible, and it has. It can go with for example, the electricity cable, which is going under the Black Sea, and it's a flagship project of EU because it's tying the Georgian grid to the European grid. It's extremely important for economy, but also for the infrastructure, but also vested interests of EU in the region. Because the biggest problem actually here is that we talk about a lot of these perks, but when it comes to tangibles, for example, the interest of businesses, etc., it's not that big. And that has been actually a huge problem of Georgian economy, because we don't have Western interests vested in a way it should be. And with this, I think that the free trade agreement with the US would have been a great thing to do, I mean, both politically, but also from an economic dimension. And there are particular reasons, for example, why Georgia is not reaping the benefits of the DCFTA, or this deep and comprehensive trade agreement with the EU. And I can name few. Of course, unfortunately, we are not competitive enough. The exports to EU are kind of large in quantity, but the quality-wise, it's not, very sophisticated. So also, it's not part of the inclusive development that it should be, meaning that not a lot of smaller or let's say not oligarchic connected businesses are exporting. So most of the exports are actually of some of the from the extraction, the mineral extraction sectors, and those sectors are actually mostly dominated by political interests. So what I mean is that there is no trickle-down effect to that, and that's going to be a problem. So this trade should be inclusive in a way that it affects larger parts of Georgian society. Of course, then there is a problem of the asymmetry of standards. EU standards are much higher, so Georgian businesses have difficulty adhering to them or keeping up with them. Also, there is a problem of business networks. Unfortunately, Georgian business networks are not that connected. Sorry, I'm going into nitty-gritty details, but I think that's important. And also, we've been talking about the value chains. And the bad thing is that we are not connected to the value chains, which are kind of the blood of the trade, but also of any type of economic activity or intrastate economic activity. So I would stop here, and then I'll be happy to answer the questions.
Last but not least is Antonia, and we'll then jump right into audience questions.
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. And I promise I will be as brief as possible. I should be, because I do geopolitics, and for me, things are supposed to be a bit clearer than the policy making in Brussels, at least. So to begin with, EU, just as NATO, is an international organization that not only has the very same feature when it comes to enlargement, which is fatigue, but it also has an important feature for what regards not only the Ukraine war now, but the current economic realignment that we are all facing and looking at and are part of, actually. And that is basically related to the fact that the EU member states do not share a common position when it comes to their own foreign policy or their own economic policy. And that has been a problem that I'm not going to get into, but it is very important for the Black Sea region. Why? Because we are dealing with an integrated, risky region. The Black Sea has become a de facto war zone, and we are all very much aware of that. Economically speaking, we are discussing, and we have been discussing, especially in London, the conference that my colleague mentioned, came with a plan for a new insurance scheme with regards to the war zone that is currently affecting the Black Sea. And that is important for the EU because the EU basically comes in with proposals for investment in what regards energy security. The EU has been funding and is funding the electricity cable that has been also mentioned here, but that electricity submarine cable would only be possible to be put into place if Russia would allow us to, meaning if we would have an environment that is secure enough for us to get to the build-up phase. Right now it is a proposal, it is something that we are working on, but obviously it is going to be very difficult to put into place, as we will have to deal with putting into place new energy investments, the ones that have been recently announced by Romania, for instance, nearby the Black Sea coast of Romania, where again we are dealing with a high-risk environment that is basically related to Russian aggression moves into the Black Sea. Now, how is this all relating to the EU role in the Black Sea now proper? Because I've been asked to tackle several elements, just as my colleagues mentioned here. So the EU has three main strategic policies with regards to the Black Sea currently. And these are the Eastern Partnership, the Neighborhood Policy, and the Black Sea Synergy. All these sound very nice on paper. There have been programs that have been pretty much supported by the EU with funding. They do have, while there are three main policy or strategy papers or strategy programs, they also have three main problems: the political will, the coordination between member states when it comes to agreeing on what projects will be implemented with regards to the region, and financial resources. Now, we all know that the financial resources problem is pretty much common to everyone these days, especially after the pandemic. Now, with regards to the Black Sea proper, if we have the energy security as a problem and as an issue to resolve, we also have the Ukrainian reconstruction also as a problem, but also as an opportunity to come all together and start working on with the financial resources available, but also with the potential of more financial resources from the global markets to come in and support what is to be said, the Ukrainian reconstruction. And why is it difficult to actually put words when I talk about the Ukrainian reconstruction? Because we are talking about scenarios of how this war is going to end and how this war is going to continue. So it is pretty much obvious that we began to see that we have an attrition war in Ukraine. And that means in economic terms that we are going to have, at least in the medium to long term or perspective long term, a war zone in the Black Sea. That basically means two things, also economically speaking. We have had a decoupling from Russia in Europe. We are having a de-risking in Europe from China. And at the same time, we are seeing a reshifting of the trade routes and investment routes in the Black Sea area and in Eastern Europe proper. What do I mean by that? So while the Ukrainian war has produced a stop for the trade routes from Asia into Europe, the Black Sea has taken that trade route into consideration, and right now we are seeing Turkey even supporting the idea of the investment on the middle corridor, linking China to Europe. Now, everything is connected, so we now have the Black Sea basically developing itself not only into a flashpoint, but into a geo-economic node and the geopolitical node, of course, which means that we have the three main regional players in Eurasia basically getting into the Black Sea and looking at the Black Sea. The EU, Russia, of course, and China. That basically means that we are going to have to deal with an EU that is not necessarily focused on helping the Black Sea area to get stronger, to get more resilient, but an EU that will be helping itself get more resilient while discussing with all these members in the Black Sea, but also with the greater powers. And while it will not be engaging with Russia, because it's pretty clear what we are getting from Russia, it is still discussing with China in a different manner than the US is discussing with China. So here we have basically the EU role in the Black Sea being shaped by the US role in the Black Sea, I believe. Especially from an economic and security standpoint. We are going to have to deal with either competition or coordination when it comes to China looking towards the European Union. And we might see the EU engaging on a more cooperation side of things, depending on how it perceives the US role in the Black Sea. What do I mean by that realistically? Everything is being shaped by perception, and I think this is very much clear for us doing political science, geopolitics, geoeconomics. Reality is shaped by perception. We already saw that starting from the early 2000s. It has been brought to our attention that basically Turkey has begun reshifting in the early 2000s. This crisis that we have in Ukraine did not start in 2008. I believe it started in 2004 when Russia basically saw the very first signs of Ukraine shifting apart from its influence. And while it did signal that it will get more involved into the region, the West was not necessarily believing it would, because Russia was weakened. In this region in particular, in the Black Sea, we know that when Russia is weakened, it will get more aggressive. Why? Because it needs to. And that is its imperative. Now, perception shapes reality again, and we are back in 2022 when we are basically seeing engagement from Russia in a very violent form. We are seeing Turkey trying to accommodate trade flows. We are seeing Turkey reaching out to Russia, but also to the West, kind of doing the middleman's role in a negotiation, if you will. And its role is shaped by the perception of a Western involvement in the Black Sea, or the lack of it. Which is why I say that it is very much important for us to signal, and the US in particular, to signal involvement in this area, presence in this area. And the shape of, paperwork, a bill is being drafted to support the Black Sea strategy. Well, for the geopolitical analyst, that's just a paper. Also for the geopolitical analyst, that is a very important signal at this moment in time, because it basically says that politically, the US has at least the intention to get in more involved in here. And that is not only a signal to Turkey, which is of course, the country that we all have on our mind when it comes to the Black Sea security, and when it comes to the Black Sea area with regards to the EU as well, because let's not forget that we also have trade to deal with, and we also have migration routes that are very important for the EU stability, that gets the EU very much nervous these days when talking to Turkey and its other partners in the Mediterranean. So not only, and I will underline, the US signal is not only important for Turkey, even if that's most urgent, but it is also important for China. Because considering that only in the first 6 years, we have seen 6 months after the war has started in Ukraine, we have seen an increase by 20% of the Asian trade on the middle corridor going through Georgia and Romania into Europe. It is likely that we are going to see more sophistication when it comes to the Chinese approach to the European Union per se, and to this area in particular. And I'm going to give you just some numbers. We have, and I will read because my memory doesn't get well with numbers. So we have China increasing its exports during the last 5 years by 6%. and its investment into Europe by 20% in the very same time. At the same time, we all know that China is not like Russia, and it is increasingly sophisticated when it gets to investment in the border areas in particular, and in Europe per se. So this is why I believe that whatever the EU role in the Black Sea will be is dependent on whatever the US role in the Black Sea will be. And it's not NATO, I'm sorry. NATO is also a political organization that will move as the US, which is still the only global superpower, will move. So that is basically my conclusion. I know it's not necessarily optimistic, and I know it raises a bunch of other questions, some of which I may be able to answer, some of which I have no answers myself. But this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, I was a student only 5 years ago, and I would never dare to keep you from food upcoming. So let's move, that being the case, straight to questions from the audience. Given the time here, I would encourage you to get to the question as fast as possible. We'll get as more in the end. So, please.
Frederick Labar, RMC, Kingston, Canada. Why not just give up on NATO altogether and focus solely on getting membership in the EU? I mean, the legal canon of underpinning the EU is also buttressed by the Brussels Treaty, which also has an Article 5. An Article 5 which is even stronger than NATO's Article 5.
It's frequently asked, so to say, why don't you join EU and then forget about NATO? I can be very blunt and will be very blunt. It's a rhetorical question. It's a premise that intellectually one can entertain. You cannot join EU with the same problems as we have with Russia for the same reasons that we cannot join NATO. So unless security is sorted out, you're not going to be part of the EU as much as you're not going to be a part of the NATO if the same policy making remains in both organizations. So I would urge, stop raising the rhetorical questions at the policy levels, those who do not here in the audience, and get real what could make all of the countries that are aspirant and otherwise deserve to be part of both to actually have a valid pathway for the membership in both organizations. And if we talk about the NATO, and I understand that it might not be perceived by NATO in the same way, but it's an issue of credibility for the NATO as well. We've been promised a membership in an affirmative way. So at some point, unless we say that we don't want it anymore, the premise is there. So if we speak about the defensive alliance, which most of the time deters any aggressive behavior against member states just by perception even, not only military capabilities, credibility and perception matters. And then when it comes to credibility, it's the credibility that policymakers, when the critical time comes, will act on Article 5 as such, if Article 5 is applicable, and I would very much hope that Zaporozhye plant could fall into that if anything happens there preemptively as well. But when it comes to the promises that are made as well, because at the end of the day, all countries are political animals. And if the words and promises and decisions have no value in it, then they lose value. And then preventative or affirmative nature that they do have. But other than that, either or is just a rhetorical question. If we become members of NATO, theoretically speaking, and then there are no security guarantees, EU will have the same security challenges at some point in terms of disruption of its economic activities and all of the rest, if security is not guaranteed, and we are still vulnerable when it comes to that. So economically speaking and pragmatically, it's more economical to be part of NATO than rather than not to be. I don't believe, for example, other than NATO security guarantees for Ukraine as well. It will take so much investment and backup and guarantees in the same way as would NATO membership require without Article 5 umbrella being put over Ukraine, which will be again the same invitation over the time in different cycles as it used to be now. It's better to put the deterrence that worked, that will work in the future as well, and be with that more economical, so to say, and resilient, rather than have creative inventions as in Bucharest 2008 instead of MOP membership promise with a deficient language as it was, rather than ignore something that already worked and continues to work.
A very short remark coming from a Romanian, because you cannot. Realistically, the set of conditionalities that you have to basically fulfill for the EU integration is larger than the set of conditionalities that you have to fulfill for NATO. And some of them are related to the conditionalities of NATO. So, yes, there is a reason why Romania, why Poland, while everyone in the Eastern European bloc has joined the EU after they have joined NATO. We have entered the NATO conditionalities pact and then the EU conditionalities pact, not because we wanted that, but because you could not get the other way around. So if you don't fulfill the conditionality pact for NATO, you will not be able to get in the EU. It's not even related to strategic thinking. But also, think about why Turkey has gave up on the EU accession pretty much officially right now, but it's still cool with being NATO. That's a rhetorical question, by the way.
Okay, well, that is a rhetorical question. Let's just keep it like that, because I have to say something. Well, Turkey joined NATO out of strategic necessity. And the European referendums prevented Turkey's accession to the EU in 2004. But it is a rhetorical question, I agree with you.
This sounds like a fascinating discussion to continue at lunch. In the interest of time, we'll take a couple more questions.
Thank you. My name is Luca Citiani. First of all, thank you for a very interesting panel. I'm left with several questions, but I'll just have to choose the most important one, I guess. So, to keep it short, what has become of associated trio format? Does this term hold any meaning at all right now? Because I understand this format is much more important to Georgia than to Moldova and Ukraine right now, at least. And to follow up on my previous questions, what can Georgia do to kind of revitalize and bring back relevancy to this format? Thank you.
Well, I think I mentioned it in my introduction that the whole logic of the association trail is going to be not there, once you become an accession country and you're recognized like that. So that we're on the brink of actually coming up with the architecture of how to move forward. So, yeah, associations don't really matter anymore once you become the accession country. Okay, so that's very clear from.
Just from the formal point of view, for some time, depending on the chapters that will be opened, there will be still reporting on the implementation of the agreements that had their own reporting cycles, meaning visa liberalization and then the rest. So there will be a little bit of a parallel track, but then the whole meaning of the political dimension of association per se obviously loses its own content or merit, because then it sort of graduates into the accession process. And when it comes to Georgia, I mean, look at that. What happens now is different from what it was when it comes to EU acting more of a strategic actor rather than just, as a continuation of the bureaucratic legacies or processes or muscle memory, so to say, of the institutions. Because what happened was that with the war in Ukraine, everybody was reminded that values and principles are not empty words. Okay, and then freedom and democracy and fighting for that is actually a possibility rather than impossibility. And if we're honest about it, not many countries, already members, either NATO or EU, could have been confident that if they would have been attacked, what would have been their determination to fight? And that's a reality. And then it was so impressive and overwhelming that it became part of the internal social discourse and political discourse in those countries. So the idea of giving a candidacy status to a country in the midst of the war was very unusual from a very bureaucratic point of view, but it became. And then Ukraine became engine for Moldova, and then could have been for us as well. So I think what we need to do profoundly is not anything about ticking the boxes on any pro forma laws that we can adopt or not adopt. First of all, we don't have to adopt the bad ones that will further away get us from the EU, just to start with that. But it's to emanate that we actually adhere to the values and principles, because the decisions are driven from that point of view now, rather than ticking from the boxes approach into it, which used to be the case for association process in some regards with DCFTA and then the rest. So now membership became real. And when it became real, and if you are about to be admitted to the family, you need to act like a family member. You need to be trusted for that. They need to understand that, you're washing the hands and you are eating in the way they eat, and you have the same values, you're ready to fight for the same things that they are about to fight, if it comes to that. We don't do that now when it comes to not the society per se, but when it comes to the state as a state, because we're conflicting on many grounds. We need to sort it out. Without that, it will be very hard to expect that because of the pro forma sort of anything, we could have a getaway. The only chance that we have now for that to happen is that support base is still strong for Georgia. In the EU, there are member countries that are forming their own axis that could do that, but they become disillusioned as well, because the countries that are the best fighters for us, they are the countries that have been always fighting for values and principles. And if we don't have that image that we are on the same page there, and we say what we mean and we act on it, then unfortunately it's going to be a very difficult potential there.
Okay. One more question, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Excellent discussion, really kind of in depth. I just have some cognitive dissonance kind of when I hear the stories here and the stories in the previous session. So it looks like every country in the Black Sea region and the development of the region overall sits on the three-leg stool. So we talk about military, economic, and their government or political development that have to be kind of brought in certain order. And as hard as it is, it comes together with the complexity with regard to the timing of those actions and kind of how to address them. We just heard that if not kind of NATO requirements fulfilled, it's a question on kind of when and how the countries can be joining the EU. So back to those excellent comments on that certain things are done within the parliament terms, other things kind of need to be linked to how the infrastructure can develop, what's the security things. So my question is, how do you see the resolvement of this timing line for the actions? Is there kind of really a solution that still have to be developed, or there is kind of just already some timeline in the region and in the EU and NATO setting? Because it sounds to me like it may not really kind of be the same timeline on the tables of different parties.
I mean, I think every country has its right to prioritize its strategic imperatives, right? And those are coming out of what are your most feared issues. In the case of the Black Sea countries, we have a common fear. From that common fear, we also have a common opportunity to work together. That said, as my colleague said, it is a unique opportunity to basically push for the political support in the EU proper and in NATO when it comes to the candidacy of countries that want to join the EU in particular and NATO. Membership is a different story, and that, on timelines, you'd have to ask someone that is an expert on how Brussels work. I'm not. So that is a different story, that is a different pain altogether, but I think that currently we have a unique opportunity to basically support politically and give signals. And then giving signals, I'm also including the US and the bill that proposes the the strategy for the Black Sea. That is an important signal for the EU, for us as member states of the Black Sea region, if you want, for us in particular, I would say, and for China and Turkey in particular as well.
Final question.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talks. My name is Emil Abdaliani. I'm from Ilia State University. I have a specific question for Antonia and Eka. Well, you mentioned you covered essentially some broader topics, such as where the EU is heading to and so on and so on. But what's your vision of Russia and where Russia might be heading? My understanding is that if you look at the territory from the Black Sea to Central Asia, you see an emerging pattern that Russia's influence is essentially, I wouldn't say increasing, it's essentially not collapsing maybe, but it's dwindling. And I like the point which Eka raised that Russia still might scramble some parts of it, but just to be short, where we seeing Russia within the sort of the new world order, I would say.
Well, it's the hardest topic, obviously, it's the hardest topic to talk about because it's in the motion right now, right? And then there are many variables that could be the black swans, or it could be something that we can predict right now. But there are several factors that I have my own clarity of mind, so to say. I'm sure that Russia will lose the war in Ukraine, and I'm sure that it will not be a war of attrition. None of the sides can have a long-term war when it comes to that scale of the war that is going on right now. So I cannot pinpoint the timeline, but then it's not a multi-year war as an active war that will be ongoing. Ramifications of that in Russia could be different in terms of the case scenarios, but none of them will be pretty. When it comes to either change of the regime or through different ways of that could happen, but it will not be a democratic forces, let's put it that way in a nutshell. We have limited time now for coming to the power. So Russia will be in a bad place for some time, but it will be retreating for some time. It will not be able to continue extremely aggressive sort of posture as it has now in Ukraine. And that will be a moment, crack in time, so to say, that need to be exploited by those who would want to have a good future and secure future for themselves, and maybe eventually for Russia as well. I would give it minimum 10 years, a bit more, maybe 15, maybe even 20, depending on how Russia from within will boil in its own juices, so to say, and emerge maybe as a better Russia. But Russia faces the problem of society as well, not just of the government and regime, right? So it will take time until it changes potentially for the better. And I think the problem with that case scenario that the West has is to realize that we were entering an uncomfortable phase. It's not post-Soviet Union dissolution phase when everybody chilled a bit, understanding that, now we have a situation of shared neighborhoods, mutual interdependencies, Nord Streams being built, money being made, dirty or not, who cared? It was just everywhere. So it's not going to be it if we will have the right policies. And right policy needs to be containing Russia. And containing Russia is the only thing that we can control or work on, rather than think and work on anything that will happen inside of Russia. The biggest mistake that everybody was making for these decades was just thinking that we can change Russia. We can trust in the beginning when Bucharest Memorandum was done and Russia emerged as an own nuclear power out of the Soviet Union space, and then sort of trusting that Russia somehow moves civil. It's a terrorist state with nuclear weapons. That's what it is right now. And want to be an empire, which will not be. So I don't see Russia being an empire or in multipolar world, that kind of a pole. It will shrink, and it will shrink in terms of the political size. I'm not determining the territorial shrink. It's hard to predict right now. What we can and should do is to strengthen ourselves. And within this policy of containment, there needs to be strengthening of the flanks. There will be no gray zones, as much as I can tell, and every country which is in the neighborhood of Russia will understand that. Gray zones, by that I mean not necessarily membership of NATO and EU. For those who want to, we have to. But countries like Kazakhstan in Central Asia, for example, Uzbekistan, when it comes to Azerbaijan and Armenian discourse right now, where US and EU are playing a great role in terms of peace settlement, and role of Turkey. Iran is in our neighborhood as well. So there will be countries that will be in Russia's axis, and there will be countries that will not support Russia or be influenced by Russia anymore. And we need to strengthen as much as we can those, and we need to be part of EU and NATO, I would argue as well. For that reason, for that flank to be strengthened, Georgia cannot be an ambivalent country in the territorial location, as it has been described in the previous panel, ambivalent under the Russian influence and prone to Russian malign influences. That weakens and makes the Western axis vulnerable on the Black Sea and beyond as well. So if Georgian society is ready to fight by becoming part of the other side that is not influenced or friends with Russia and is not having a claim that we can be neutral and friends with everybody, because it's not going to be possible, as much as it never has been possible in this region, then we need to be ready to be strong, resilient, part of the family in which we see that we belong ourselves to. But Russia will be a country that one needs to contain for quite some time. It will not be a partner, and business as usual will not come soon. And at least for a decade, that should be the policy, I would say.
Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your participation with the questions.